Good day, everyone. This is Jack Van Horn from the BD2K Training Coordinating Center based at the University of Southern California. I'd like to welcome you to our Big Data to Knowledge Guide to the Fundamentals of Data Science. And today we're absolutely delighted to have Nils Gehlenborg speaking on the subject of data visualization, tools, and communications. Nils is a Associate Professor in the Department of Biomedical Informatics at Harvard Medical School. And his research and work is on the subject of developing novel tools to visualize 3D genomic information as well as heterogeneous data from large-scale cancer genomic studies. He's a co-investigator for the 4D Nucleome Network Data and Coordination and Integration Center hosted at Harvard Medical School, and he's the co-founder, former general chair, and current steering committee chair of BioViz, which is the Symposium on Biological Data Visualization. He's the co-founder of VISB, the annual workshop on visualizing biomedical data, and co-chairs the policy working group for the 4D Nucleome Network, which is an NIH Common Fund project. He's served on the program committees of several international bioinformatics and visualization conferences and held multiple editorial roles, including his current role as associate editor of BMC Bioinformatics. He's contributed to the Points of View data visualization column in Nature Methods, and we are absolutely delighted to have you, Nils, and we look forward to your presentation.
Go. Hi, everyone. My apologies for being muted for a second. Apparently, the software just detected new hardware and put a dialog on my screen that I didn't see. Let's try this again. I hope you can all see my screen. And thank you very much for the invitation, Jack, and for the nice introduction. So I'm here today to give you an important warning, an important message. If people try to sell you fancy visualization tools that have something about 3D, exciting, colorful, interactive scatter plots, you should be careful and have a very close look at why this scatter plot is in 3D and if that makes any sense at all. So, the title of the talk today about tools for data visualization and communication. I thought a little bit more about this. I first thought I'm going to tell you about all these exciting cutting-edge tools that we have for different data types. But in the end, I realized that BD2K is such a broad audience, and there's so many people doing so many exciting things with so many different data types, I couldn't possibly cover all of them in this hour that we have today. So I decided instead to interpret tools as tools that you can use to figure out what is a good visualization tool and what is not such a good visualization tool, and also then how we can use visualization really to communicate. So I'm going to cover those things, and I want to give you a quick overview of the outline here for today. I'm going to start with use cases for data visualization and how visualization works. And I will talk a little bit about how we use visualization to encode data for visualizations. I'll talk about common mistakes that we make all the time and that we see all over the place once we know that they are mistakes. And finally, I want to emphasize how we can use visualization for communication. So, use cases for data visualization. Let me start, though, with the question, how does data visualization work to begin with? And this sentence might be more than you expect. So visualization uses perception to free up cognition. What the heck does that mean? So I'll give you an example. Here is the sequence of human insulin. So these are 110 amino acids. And I'm asking you, is there a proline in the sequence? For those who do not know what a proline is, it's a P in the sequence. And what you're going to start doing right now, unless you know that there's pollen in there, you will start to scan the sequence sequentially. You start at the top left and scan through. If I show you this and ask you, is there a proline in this sequence? You'd say yes right away without scanning anything. So here we're using something preattentive processing, and I'll get into that in a second, what that means. But we can use visualization to really make information jump out. In this case, we're using color to encode a letter in the sequence, and it allows us to perceive these letters without linearly or sequentially scanning the scene in front of us. And so this is an example where we're using perception rather than cognition to interpret data. And that's what visualization allows us to do. It really, in a way, it's another term for what visualization is. It's an external cognitive aid, and it allows us to augment our working memory. And I have another example here that I think is very, very insightful. So when you learn how to multiply large numbers, I don't know, 4th grade or 3rd grade, you'll learn this technique where you're adding them up step by step. Well, you multiply and then add them up step by step. So that is another example for an external cognitive aid. You're externalizing information, putting it out in front of us so that we can think about what matters and break the problem down. That's what visualization does as well. And here's another example of how that looks. If I give you two functions and ask you, do they intersect? Do they cross 0 anywhere? Again, what you need to do, if I show you this table, you need to try to figure out what the shape of these curves is, or these functions. In fact, for 2 of them, and figure out if they might be intersecting. If I just plot them, you can look that up. So your eye beats your memory in here, and you're able to answer these questions much, much faster. Okay, so that's how data visualization works in very basic terms. Now, how do we use this? How can we exploit the fact that we now can externalize things, that we can offload work to our perceptual system? So one example is, and I'm going to use a quote here that I think almost everyone has said at some point in their life, so I believe it when I see it. And yeah, we don't know who really came up with that first, but it's certainly an important question. And I want to give you an example why that matters, or why that is related to data visualization. So here's something that many of you probably have seen before or know about, and that is Anscombe's Quartet. Anscombe's Quartet is a set of 4 functions that, upon initial sort of inspection with some simple summary statistics, appear to be identical. All 4 of them have the same mean for x and the same mean, the same variance for x, the same mean for y, same variance for y, have the same correlation between x and y, and also have the same linear regression line. So, well, this data set is small, so by looking at the numbers, you can see, well, they are not the same. But imagine this was a data set with hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of rows. You would think you have 2 or 4 identical data sets. Maybe they're not sorted the same way if they look different at the top. Let's plot the data and see what happens. So here is Anscombe's Quartet plotted, and we see very clearly that these functions are not the same. And this is an example where we're using data visualization to confirm an assumption that we have about data. And the trick here is that visualization can be used in a way where it's completely unbiased to any underlying assumptions or models that you might be applying here, and when you do statistics. And this is why we can really explore data and look at data in this way, and hopefully not make mistakes like we would have made if we would have just used some summary statistics. And this is thanks to Francis Anscombe, who was a statistician. Now, another use case for data visualization is, when you ask yourself, well, is there any data in are there any patterns in my data? And that is where we're using data visualization as an exploratory tool to generate hypotheses. And we will visualize data and then start looking for patterns, such as trends or gaps in the data, outliers or clusters, and then start to reason about why these things are there. Why is there a gap in the data? Did our measurement device not work? Or is this really something that happened? Was there just no signal during that time? So this allows us to generate hypotheses. And once you have a hypothesis, and of course the next step is to try to come up with statistical or computational approaches to follow up on them, particularly in large data sets. But this is the first step. When we're doing data-driven research, we have to come up with hypotheses after we have generated data, and that's why data visualization is so important and is getting so much more attention these days, because we need to come up with good hypotheses. We're not collecting data just to test a hypothesis. We just start with the data, and we need, as a first step, come up with good hypotheses, and so that's why we're really interested in having good visualization approaches. Finally, there is a third use case for data visualization, and that is nicely summarized by this quote by Napoleon. A good sketch is better than a long speech, or also known as a picture's worth 1,000 words. And there is a wonderful example for what that could mean, and it also involves Napoleon. It's Napoleon's biggest defeat, so this is a little bit ironic. Napoleon's March on Moscow. I'm sure many of you have seen this. This is an infographic by someone called Charles Minard, who was lived about 2 centuries ago, and he created these figures based on data, in fact. And in this example, you can see sort of the size of Napoleon's army marching towards Moscow. That's the light brown line or orange line that's getting smaller and smaller. And then the way back when they were retreating is the black line as it gets even smaller. And there are interesting things you can observe in here, how the size of the army is sort of somewhat correlated with the temperature that is dropping, as well as with situations where they have to cross rivers. That always leads to larger losses. And so this figure is pretty famous, so I'm not going to go into much more detail here. Now, visualization use. And there are also different kind of situations in which we use visualization for these things. So for example, so we can obviously always go back and forth between all three options, and this is in fact what we do all the time. But we also need to be aware that, for example, when we're looking at confirmation exploration, this is a dialogue between a computer and an analyst. But when we present data, we have a dialogue between an analyst and an audience. So there are some differences. We use different ways of looking at the data. We have different kind of needs for our visualizations, and I'm going to get into that, and we'll come back to this at the very end of the presentation. So to begin with, if we want to visualize data, we need to somehow take the values in the data set and turn them into something visual, into something graphic. And this is the step where we encode data for visual representation. And I want to give you an example of why we really need to think about how to do this and why that matters. And so there's a wonderful paper by a colleague of mine, Michelle Borkin, and other colleagues here at Harvard, who studied visualization of arteries in the heart to diagnose heart disease. And the paper is called Evaluation of Artery Visualization for Heart Disease Diagnosis. And the question that they were trying to answer is how to best visualize something called endothelial shear stress. That has to do with the blood flow through the arteries. And so it is apparently so that there are areas where you have low endothelial shear stress. You get buildup of plaques, and they're dangerous. And where you have higher shear stress, that is less risky. And so there was a new device that is able to actually get data about where there's high shear stress and low shear stress in the heart arteries. And they set out to compare sort of an existing approach of visualizing this information to a novel approach that they developed. And what they found was pretty striking, although maybe not surprising for someone who's familiar with data visualization techniques and approaches. So I want to walk you through this real quick. But traditionally, the heart arteries were visualized as these blocks, rectangles. Essentially, they rolled up, well, cut open the artery and rolled it out. And then they plotted on top the shear stress measurements. So high shear stress, as I said, is better actually, is indicated by red in this example, and low shear stress is indicated by blue, and that is where dangerous situation can arise. So That is one way to look at this artery. The other way is to have a 3D model and map these shear stress values on top of it. So this is the starting point. Now, yeah, as I said, this is a traditional 2D projection, traditional 3D projection. The first thing that they did is they asked clinicians what color map would you actually like to use to visualize this kind of information. And lo and behold, the first choice of the clinicians was this rainbow color map. And the second choice was this option F here. So the reason why they picked the rainbow color map is that that's what we see all the time. We know what that means. Okay, fair enough. So let's go with this. They also explored the second choice, which was this color map, which had for low values, bright red, and then going to black via white for high shear stress regions. So that was the first thing that they did. And so, you know, for example, what you can do now is you can map the new color map on top of a 3D model. And as you might know, 3D models are great. If you have them in front of you, you can touch them. It's hard sometimes to interact with them when you're on a computer screen because that screen is two-dimensional. So in order to see all sides of this model, we have to rotate it, we have to zoom in and out potentially, and that's all an effort that we have to put into seeing that. So they came up with this very smart way of representing this artery tree, and that's this one. So they created a two-dimensional representation that still has pretty much the same information in it. They're using this two-dimensional artery representation, but what they did, in addition to just showing a rectangle with equal height across the whole rectangle, they actually indicate the diameter of the artery by shrinking and scaling the height of the rectangle along the way. So we have a pretty good idea where the arteries are wide, and we have also a pretty good idea. The other advantage is we simply do not have to rotate anything. We just look at the screen and we can see it. So this is a wonderful situation to be in, and you'll see in a second why that really matters. So here's a new visual representation. And what they found when they asked a set of about 20 medical students to identify problematic areas where there's low shear stress, so regions that indicate that this patient is at risk of heart disease and serious, potentially fatal problems, they asked them to look at 4 different types of visualizations. The one that I'm showing right now, this 2D representation with this novel color map. They asked them to look at the same 2D representation with a rainbow color map. And they also asked them to look at the 3D projection with a color map, with the rainbow color map, and with the new color map that I'm showing you here. And the results were striking in the sense that when we look at the percentage of areas of low endothelial shear stress that the medical students identified, when you compare the 2D maps between the 2 color maps. So the new color map is the darker bar, the lighter bar is the rainbow color map. When you compare these two, you see there's a difference from 91% of all low ESS areas were identified in the 2D color map, and the 2D representation with the diverging color map, and only 62% were identified in this 2D representation with the rainbow color map. And it gets even worse when we look at the 3D model with the 2 different color maps. So 71% of all low ESS regions identified with the 3D model and the diverging color map, and only 39% were identified with the 3D model and the rainbow color map, which is what clinicians have been using. And so, as you see, there are statistically significant differences in terms of the ability of these clinicians or medical students to identify these areas. And now the work that Michelle Borkin and her colleagues presented there is based on a solid understanding of what visualizations work and which ones don't work. And that's why we can see that there are indeed big differences. If you do your job well when it comes to visualization, it matters. So this is my motivation to tell you a bit more about how we can encode data and why it really matters to get this right. So here is a very simple taxonomy of data. I'm not going to spend much time on it. We essentially start out with data. It can be tabular data, and it can have categorical order data, and order data itself can be ordinal or quantitative. So ordinal is simply ordered, and we can have categories that we can order, for example, and quantitative data we can also do some algebra and compute on it. Additionally, we have relational data. That means links, such as networks or trees, between different types of entities. And we also have spatial data. So that means spatial data is data that comes with an intrinsic position within space, whether that's absolute or relative, doesn't really matter. You can imagine, for example, the locations of atoms in a protein structure. MRI data is spatial data, and X-ray data is spatial data. Those kind of things are special because they do have a real-world representation. Everything to the left of spatial is abstract data. And that's where we are completely free to choose our encoding because there is no real-world representation that we would know of, generally. So, I mean, with relational data, I can imagine, you know, well, on the other hand, if you talk about it as like a road network, that is spatial data that has some relational aspects to it, for example. But it's important to distinguish these two things from each other. And now we can ask, how can we encode data when we have data falling into different categories? So, for example, we can start thinking about categorical data. We're asking questions like, what is it, or where is it? And here we can use a plane and place items, data types, data points or objects on a plane. And depending where we place them, that assigns them a category. So you can imagine you're, you know, cleaning up your desk in your office, and you make 3 piles of paper, you know, stuff that goes into recycling, stuff that needs to be filed, and stuff that you really should have done yesterday. So there are 3 categories, very clear to distinguish them from each other. It's very easy to figure out what is what. We can do the same thing by assigning colors. And in this case, what we actually use, the component of the color model here is hue, but commonly we refer to this as the color of an object. Shapes can be used to encode categories. And then we can basically order these things and how, with respect to how accurately we could recall that information, like which category was assigned to an object. The best or the most accurate encoding is really position, and when you go to shapes, that gets very problematic. At some point, when you go to shapes with many corners, that gets pretty tricky to distinguish them from each other, for example. The same with colors, and we'll get to that. Relational data can be encoded, for example, by using something called containment. I can put things that belong together into the same area and things that do not belong there outside of that area. I can use connections, which is what we typically do when we think about node link diagrams, for example, or similarity is another way to encode this kind of data. And again, the 4th option is to use proximity. So things that are closer to each other belong together, and things that belong somewhere else are further away. So again, there's a way to order these. I think most obvious, this becomes most obvious how important this is when we look at quantitative and ordinal data. So the most accurate way to convey that information, and the way which makes it easiest for us to recall sort of what is the quantity or what is the value here, is to use positions on a common scale. We can also use positions on unaligned scales, so where we have the origin of the scale can move in space or on a plane. We can use length of objects. We can use angles or tilt. And maybe already start thinking about bar charts and pie charts. Area can be used to encode quantities. Curvature. I've never seen a really good visualization that would use curvature, but it's possible. Volumes are used very, very often. Unfortunately, that's not a very good encoding. Remember the PCA example that I showed you in the beginning that also used size of 3D spheres on a flat screen. Lightness can be used. So basically how light or dark, how much light you add basically in the grayscale. And color saturation is another option. But color saturation really is not a good choice for quantitative data. Which maybe you're thinking now, wow, we're using heat maps all the time, for example, for gene expression data or other similar data. And yes, we are using that, or lightness, but we should not be using this for any quantitative data. Whatever we want to encode or show with these things should be generally qualitative. So again, here's the ranking. And you can also then look across these different ways or different data types and different encodings, and you'll see, you know, depending on what you have, certain things will work better and other things won't work as well. So it's very important to think about that encodings that you want to use when you start working with data. And I want to give you one example, just another simple example where you can see what a difference that can make. So you might all be familiar with these kind of diagrams where we're using circles and numbers in them and intersections of circles to encode some overlap of sets. So this is from a paper that was in Nature Communications. It doesn't really matter. This was called a Venn diagram. It turns out, in fact, this is not a Venn diagram. This is actually an Euler diagram. There's a slight difference. So in a Venn diagram, you show all intersections that are possible between your sets. And in an Euler diagram, you just show those that actually exist. And so this example is not an Euler diagram. Sorry, it's not a Venn diagram. It's an Euler diagram. And when we try to interpret data in these things, so first of all, the first question is like, let me just ask you, what is the biggest intersection here? And now what happens when you look at this, well, there are a lot of numbers. So you would sequentially go through and try to find all of them and not miss one and try to remember which one is the largest. If I would ask you, sort of, what is the distribution? Is there like one really big one and then it's sort of fizzling out? Is it normally distributed, or what sort of distribution do we see here? You can try to do this, but it's not straightforward because, again, you need to look at all the numbers and try to remember, because this visualization does not convey this. So this, in fact, is a non-area proportional diagram here. You can only make these Venn diagrams area proportional so that the area corresponds to the number written in the area for up to 3 sets. Beyond that, you can't even do that. But the problem here is, even if we would now look at these areas, like what we're using to encode the area is a shape. Sorry, what we're using to encode the number, we're using an area. And these are all areas of even like irregular shapes. They're not even all the same. It's not that they're all circles, which you could easily compare. They have all sorts of shapes here. Right? And if you go back to this example here, right, so area is not a very accurate or useful encoding for quantities. This is pretty far down the list. It's even worse than angles, which we're using in pie charts. And you all hopefully know that pie charts are not a good way to represent data. So what can we do about this? So when we apply our principles that I just talked about how to encode data, we arrive at something that looks like this, for example, which is an offset plot where we encode the size of the area, so the size of the intersection in the length of a bar and the height of the bar. So you can make a bar chart and then just place below the bar chart a little matrix that shows which of the sets involved are intersecting. And I can now easily answer the question, which one is the largest intersection? In fact, it's not even an intersection. In this case, we're looking at SNPs that were called by 4 different callers. We can see there's one caller that generated an awful lot of SNPs that none of the other callers found. And this is MAQ. We can also start organizing these bars in this bar chart. Now that we are free to reorder them, for example, we can order them rather than by size of the bar. We can group them based on the number of intersections that are participating, or number of sets that are participating in an intersection. And here we see, for example, well, there's a lot of these larger intersections that actually have 2 or 3 sets in them. There's the outlier with 1 set, or one where we're only looking at a single set. And the case where we're looking at all 4 intersections is actually pretty small. But this is just another example to show you that when we apply the proper encoding, we generally end up with a better visualization than if we just encode the data in a way that maybe looks good. Okay. Now, as you've seen, we often have many data types and many ways to encode them. And so how do we pick the one, the encoding that's the best or that's most effective here? And so there's something called the principle of importance ordering when it comes to picking encodings, and that says encode more important information more effectively. This is something that it's a statement or a quote from by Jack McInlay. For those who know Tableau software, Jack McInlay was a data visualization researcher for many years and then co-founded this very, very successful data visualization, data analytics, and visual analytics company. But he has done very fundamental research in that area, and that's probably one of the reasons why they're so successful. Now, ranking of encoding. So the first question to ask is generally, how accurately can the data be read from the visualization? But there are other things to consider. For example, when we talk about categories, we want to be able to discriminate them from each other. If we have lots of them, we need to know how many categories our encoding can actually support. So discriminability, for example, is a question. Before we get there, I apologize, I want to also briefly show you another example for the encoding for the scenario where we're looking at accuracy and what kind of problems we can run into this, even if we have a great encoding. So typical example, we have a table, a bunch of items, and we have a couple of categories. And now we can ask all sorts of questions about that. For example, you might ask, what we might be interested in, like, so what is the total value for each item? And we can look at it like this. And so this is a stack bar chart, so that works pretty well if you're primarily interested in the total. Now, questions that become much harder is, for example, to see what is the contribution of, say, category 3 to each of these items. Now, we're looking at these green areas, or green sub-bars within this bar chart. And, well, to know which one of those is the longest, I mean, they're not very different. We can see this from the table. But one of them is longer, actually by 3 units, than one of the others. So the first one, for item 1, is the value for the green one is 18, and for in item 5, the value for the third category is only 15. But to see that is not that straightforward because these are not aligned to each other. And so this visualization might work well if you're really primarily interested in the total, and that's the key thing you want to know. But if you care more about, what are the contributions of these categories across the items, if you want to ask that question, we can now answer that question very easily when we use something called a layered bar chart, where we have multiple bar charts that still would convey somewhat. We could still tell maybe which one is the largest one. It's not easy, but we can try to sort of visually add it up here. But this representation is much better to see the distribution within each category. And finally, there's also this option, the group bar chart, where we want to just know, or where we care more about how do these categories contribute for each item. Like, what is the distribution of those? Are they all roughly the same, or are they very different? And that can be achieved with this group bar chart. And the point I want to make here is, even an accurate encoding is not going to get you a perfect answer. There's always a trade-off like this one, where you need to understand not only what are the values that I care about, but also what is it that ultimately we want to communicate here. And so, you can't have it all, unfortunately, with visualization. There's very rarely an optimal solution. There are often acceptable solutions, but they will not answer all questions perfectly well. So, in addition to the accuracy of visual encodings, we can look at channels, but preattentive processing. And so this is a little test. I hope this is going to work on this webinar. I'm going to show you a couple of slides where we have these little visualizations where we have a couple blue dots, and they will flash up several times for about 250 milliseconds. And sometimes there will be a red dot in there, a red circle, and sometimes there won't. And for you, just try to see whether you can spot that red circle among the blue circles as this is happening. So let's just try this real quick. So nothing, nothing. There it is. So I hope, there's another one, I hope you were able to spot this. This is pretty easy, because color is a property that can be processed preattentively. Remember this from the very beginning when I showed you the insulin sequence and asked you to look for prolines. So with color, we can really exploit our ability to see certain things without sequentially scanning the scene in front of us. So this is sort of the idea that something really jumps out at you when you're looking at it. So we can do the same thing with shapes and circles. Do you think that's going to work? I see a lot of question marks, imaginary question marks over imaginary people listening to this presentation, but let's give it a try. So I'll, again, flash these scenes for 250 milliseconds, and sometimes there will be a red circle among the red squares, and sometimes there won't. And let's see if you can spot it. Just pay attention. Did you see it? There's another one. So the answer is you should be able to see it. I hope some of you did. It is known that shape is a property, again, that can be processed preattentively. And now let's try one more thing, where we're combining two two possible encodings. So we can use shape and color. And do you think you'll be able to spot the red circle among the blue circles and red squares? And for those who at least saw the red circle among the red squares, you can be hopeful that you might spot it here as well. Let's try. So, you probably are disappointed because it is not possible. So once you start combining different encodings, different channels for encoding, so shape and color, preattentive processing breaks down. It no longer works. That's something we'll come back to at the very end of the presentation as well. Problem. So that's something to keep in mind when we pick an encoding, and also whether we can separate channels from each other. That's another problem. So, for example, if we have two very small areas, like two very small circles, we might not be able to tell what color they are. So that's something to keep in mind if we combine them. Or if we have a very, very small circle and a very, very small rectangle, often it's not possible to really distinguish them. So these things break down at some point. Okay. Now, I'm being told I have to maybe stand closer to the microphone. Hopefully it works. Okay, so what we're going to talk about now are common mistakes when picking encodings. So the first step here is to look at colors and color maps. Rainbow color maps are all over the place, and I've already demonstrated that they are not doing a good job. What is the problem with rainbow color maps? So first of all, for rainbow color maps, there's no natural order. Well, there's a natural ordering, and it's a color. The light spectrum has a natural ordering for the rainbow color map, but it's not something that we are sort of intrinsically aware of. That you know, the colors are ordered sort of in red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. That's something I have to think about and try to remember this nice shortcut, Roy G. Biv, to do that. So hard to order. It's not clear how they should be ordered. Look at a grayscale color map. It's very easy. There are two different ways of how you can order a color map. Well, you can order them in one way, and then you can say either dark is the smallest value or dark is the highest value, and it's very clear how they're relative to each other. Rainbow color maps have a problem with resolution. For example, because our ability to distinguish different green hues from each other is much worse than, say, distinguishing other, like even lightness contrasts from each other. We cannot see this sort of this ripple pattern here that you see in this figure when you look at the very top. There's the ripples, but you don't see them in the rainbow color map because we cannot distinguish these greens from each other. So it has lower resolution, actually, although you'd think, wow, there are more colors, so we can get better resolution, but you can't. The same is true for artifacts. So if you encode, say, a linear function that goes from 0, 0 to 1, 1, that's sort of a linear slope going up, you can do this with grayscale. Very clear, this is linear slope going up. If you use a rainbow color map, you start introducing artifacts, and it looks more like it's sort of a step function because you see sort of red, yellow, green, and that looks nothing like the actual shape of the curve. It would just be a straight line that increases steadily. Other problems with rainbow color maps, for example, it doesn't have a natural zero crossing built in. So if you apply this to something where the zero crossing is important, you do not see the zero. So here's an example of like mapping this to elevations in the Gulf of Mexico and Florida. So you would not want to use that rainbow color map or rainbow encoding to like determine like where the water starts and where it ends, because you simply can't see it. It just is yellow across the board. And that's why we use different types of color maps when zero really matters. Another thing to keep in mind is color is relative, and many of you, if not all of you, will remember the black and blue dress or the white and gold dress, depending on which one you saw in that picture. So we perceive color relative to its environment, to the surrounding colors, and there are some examples. For example, we can make two different colors look the same here in the middle. Like there's both rounds for the higher one and the one of the lower rectangle look the same, but when you put them next to each other, you see they're not the same. And we can do the opposite. We can take two identical colors and make them look different by changing the background color. And why does it matter? It matters because we're constantly using heat maps to encode our data, in particular large and big data sets. And if you try to read anything quantitative of these maps to begin with, it's bound to fail because it's very bad encoding, as I showed you. It's not an accurate encoding. And on top of that, we have this issue that colors that might look different or the same are actually often not, because again, it depends on the background color and the surrounding color. So these two colors labeled with an asterisk here are the same color, same value, but they look totally different. Here, it looks like a larger value, and here it looks like a lower value, but it's simply because of the context of these colors. Discriminability of colors, as I point out, is a problem. So in general, you can assume 6 to 12 colors can be discriminated, but you often have to have more categories. And here's an example where that fails. Like you see, on the left-hand side, we have mouse chromosomes, and each mouse chromosome was assigned a color. So there are 21 colors. And then for sort of a symptom mapping, they were mapped on top of human chromosomes to see which parts of which mouse chromosome end up in each human chromosome. And while on the right-hand side, you can just tell that there are 21 different colors. You can easily distinguish them from each other there. If you would go back now to the human chromosomes, pick a random green area and try to map that back to the mouse chromosomes, this is most likely going to fail because we're not able to distinguish these different greens from each other. The same holds true for the blues as well, which are very hard to map back because they're no longer next to each other. Okay, color blindness is an issue. Probably all familiar with this. Many journals, luckily these days, tell authors do not send us a red, green, anything, unless you have a dual encoding where you use another variable, visual encoding, to distinguish between things, because if you're colorblind, you will not be able to tell the difference between red and green, for example, in a heat map. So this on the left-hand side is the actual heat map, on the right-hand side is a simulation of how someone with red, green colorblindness would perceive it. Simple answer to this is use blue and red. That can always be distinguished. Color mapping, again, to come back to similar to the problem with the rainbow color map applied to elevation. If we have, again, a simple function simply increases your, all the values are between 0 and 10, so no zero crossing. If you start mapping a color map to a divergent color map that, for example, has white between blue and red, will create artifacts because there is nothing, the way if you map this, you can see this here at the bottom, it's sort of darker, it's getting, dark, and then getting lighter and lighter, and then suddenly it's getting darker again. So you would think that potentially the shape of this curve is something like it goes up and goes up and goes down again, but this is not the case. And in particular, by adding white in between, you can create heat maps that look like they're striking features that are standing out, and unfortunately I didn't include an example here, but there's no such thing. It's simply a linear increase. But because we go through white, that will make a very strong color contrast, and that can be very, very misleading. So here's a couple of examples for better color mappings. Okay, so to remember, color used poorly is worse than no color at all. And with this, I think what I'm going to do, I want to tell you a little bit more about the D3 problems. Sorry, not the D3, the 3D problems. And that is shown in this slide. So we are often working or sort of faced with like, oh, couldn't we make it three-dimensional because we have maybe 3 different variables to show? And my answer is no, you cannot make it three-dimensional. And the reason why you cannot make it three-dimensional and why that generally does not work is the following. So here is an example, a little bit of DNA, and you perceive it as something three-dimensional on your screen, and the reason for that is because we're applying something called depth cubes. So there's occlusion, like something in front, it's closer to you, or in front will be closer to you than something behind it. So that's hit. There's something is hidden. We do see differences in size of the same object, and when we see that, then we know that something that's smaller, but the same object is bigger or closer is closer to us. We can see shading. So shading is when there's a light source. Things that are further away or facing away from the light source, they will be darker than things that are facing the light source. Additionally, we use something called perspective, which you're all familiar with, which just means essentially parallel lines sort of meet each other in the distance. That's another indicator that we're looking into some three-dimensional scene. And now we're using all these things. We're using size, shading, meaning color, the directionality of lines for perspective. Now, all these things are things that we usually use to encode data. And that can lead to a lot of problems when we try to encode data using exactly the same kind of encodings or the same kind of channels that we use to make something look 3D. So here's an example. I don't want to, sorry, the example is coming up here. I don't want to go into much detail. Sort of a three-dimensional heat map which encodes additional values. For example, here we see problem number one. We have perspective. That means there's distortion. So things that are closer to us will naturally appear taller and larger than things that are further away. So we've got to be careful with that. Another problem that we see here is that, of course, when there's something tall in front of us, now in this 3D scene, we can't look through it. So there will be occlusion. Things will be hidden behind other things, otherwise it won't appear as 3D. And so there are many, many issues like that. So it is generally not a good idea to go to 3D because it will cause more problems than it's worth. Occlusion here, another example, is a 3D network representation. So you could imagine, you know, this blob here in the top right. We don't know what's behind it. We know it's 3D, but in order to look behind it, we have to start rotating this thing. And rotating is work. And visualization should not create more work. It should reduce work, right? That's what I said in the beginning. It should allow us to use our perceptual system to see things and perceive things and to make this more efficient and not to add additional manual labor to the process of interpreting the data. Here's another example for occlusion and perspective. If I would ask you, what is the pattern in the data here? Hard to answer this from this perspective. So if we encode this differently, say using a heat map, to see the pattern is actually pretty straightforward. That is the pattern. It's a big question mark. Okay, so that's a bunch, well, these are a bunch of issues you can run into when you pick the wrong encodings. Now I want to move towards the end of my presentation and talk briefly about visualization for communication. So my first point that I want to make is, when we use visualization to communicate something, I think for this crowd here in this lecture, we're often communicating by putting a figure into a paper. And so my answer to that is, put the insights into your figure and the paper, but put your data into a database. So when we create figures, we're often feeling the need, whether this is our sort of, whether this is coming directly out of our heart to show what we've done, or whether it's our PI or someone else telling us we need to show all these things to convince the reader, I would say this is not a good idea. So data belongs into a database so people can, we should not just try to visualize everything. And you know, there's no point in having a full-page heat map, because in the end, it's a qualitative pattern that often can be represented much better than just showing like, oh, here are all these things that we did and all the data generated. I think that belongs to the database. And it is important to really focus on the message. This is our job in writing a paper. It's to communicate clearly what we found. And even when it involves data, that can be done. So here's an example that I want to give you. Here are a couple of numbers. And you know, when we look at these numbers, this is our data. Right? We can interpret this in many different ways, for example. Right? So we could look at these numbers and ask ourselves, well, does it matter that they're, you know, the values in the first row are all odd and the values in the second row are all even? Is that the point of this visualization? We don't know. So let's try this differently, right? So now we've binned the values, and you know, we're trying to, what we're really trying to get across here is something that you'll see at the very end. But now we've binned the values. We're using sort of aggregation. So we have 3 categories now of our values. So between 0 and 30, between 31 and 60, and between 61 and 100. Now we have these bins here, right? So it's the same data, but they're in 3 different categories, essentially. And now we can ask, well, is the order of the values actually important here? Is that what we're trying to learn from this data, from this visualization, that there is some ordering of these things? No, probably not. So if not, then why don't we show it like this? So we have 3 categories, and we have their size. And now we can see if that's clear. But probably now we start wondering, do we really need to show the distribution of the values in each category, or do we just care about the number of elements in this category, which would look something like this. So here are 4 visualizations of exactly the same data, and each of them can lead to completely different interpretations of what is the message that you're trying to get across. In this case here, the message that we want to get across is there are relatively few values in the middle range here. So there are very few in the category 31 to 60. That is the message, and that is very clear here, right? So we have nothing that distracts us from that. We're not distracted by any order or by any specific values. We can see this very clearly in this example. So we're going from something very unfocused, where we could interpret all sorts of things into the data, into the visualization, to something that is very, very focused on the message. And that is very important. So there's another more data-driven example. You know, when you have something like gene expression data, you can always plot a heat map, and that's what always is happening, because a heat map is sort of a very universal approach. You get a good number of genes, for example, and a good number of conditions plotted, and you can cluster the heat map, or you have to cluster the heat map. You can bring out some patterns. But it is not very helpful when you have, you know, 1,000 or 5,000 rows in your heat map, because there will be overplotting. Even if you look at it on the screen has about 1,000, 2,000 pixels, maybe maximum height, that you can even distinguish from each other. So in that case, if you have that many values, you maybe care more about sort of generally what clusters are there, and then something like a dimensionality reduction approach could work much better, because it brings out the clusters more clearly, and maybe that should be your message in that case, if you want to really show all of your data that there are a number of clusters, because then the profiles, you cannot make them out anyways. So that's a solution for many profiles, but lower resolution. There's less information, of course, when we do dimensionality reduction. On the other end of the spectrum, on the left, where we have very few profiles, and where we maybe want to indicate there's some really subtle differences, or where we care really about the shape of these profiles, we can use a parallel coordinates, or sort of this line plot, that we can get the message across there. But we have a lot of downsides there, because there's overplotting happening. When there are too many of these lines, it becomes really hard to follow the lines. But that's something we need to keep in mind. The same thing is true for networks. So this is a node link diagram representation of a network. So a network is simply a graph data structure. It's something that has not necessarily a visual representation. And then we plot them as this example, a node link diagram, where every node in the graph is a circle, and then we render lines between the circles when they're connected in the graph. If we care about the connectivity of individual nodes, maybe the circle layout is good, which just orders the circle or the nodes based on how connected they are to other nodes in the network. We can see that there are about maybe a good quarter of them are highly connected, while in the other layout, this force-directed layout, we get much better focus on like which ones are highly connected among themselves and which node is a hub, so a central node in here. So pick your layouts correctly. And we should also never forget that a network doesn't have to be rendered as a node link diagram. That's one way to look at it. We can also look at it like as an adjacency matrix, where we can see different things. For example, in the adjacency matrix, we don't have a problem with lines crossing each other. We can still, here on the right-hand side, on the bottom right, we can see very nicely that there is a cluster of highly connected nodes in this network. We can also see this hub at the top, this green node in the top left corner, which has a lot of connections to other nodes, which among themselves are not necessarily connected. The downside of the adjacency matrix is it's very hard to trace a path between, say, two nodes that are not necessarily directly connected. To answer that question is a hard work in a node, is fairly easy in a node link diagram, but it's really much harder in an adjacency matrix. We can use, in communication, we should also always remember that how we lay out information or data in front of the user can convey a message. Here we have 4 things that are sort of equal. They have equal weight. There's no clear ordering to this. Maybe you could say, well, let's get into it. So you could interpret some sort of ordering. This is pretty much the same thing that I already just explained to you. Let's focus on the message, right? So we can use Gestalt laws to convey this. So here are 2 pairs of things that we compare to each other. Right? Now, by simply moving the middle closer to each other and leaving a larger gap between the 2 groups. Here, we have something that is sequential. We go probably from left to right. There are 4 steps, or 4 time points. That is important to think about that in your visualizations and visual representations. Like, what is it that you want to convey? Well, and to go back to this, of course, if you publish in a journal, there's always a problem that, well, there's not enough space to convey it in the way how we want it. So, but keep that in mind. There's sometimes a way around it. Another thing is to, not overly use color. There's something called the data-ink ratio. So your data uses little to maximize this data to ink ratio. You'll get much better figures that are not distracting but focus on the data. And finally, don't shout at your audience. Not like I'm doing this right now. Take it back. Try to think about what is important. What is the message you want to get across? To reduce, for example, color and unnecessary embellishments like making a 3D effect or drop shadows. If your message is simply to say, well, there are two things, the A's and the D's, that lead to what the outcome is here, cancer. So there's a big difference when you compare these two slides that I just showed you. Here, I think you get a much better idea of what the message might be. And with that, I just want to come back to my sort of the starting point here. This dialogue between computer and analyst is something where we need as much data as possible because we do not know what the story is that we might want to communicate at some point. So that's where we want to have access to almost all the data in the world you could get. But that is not true when you go to present this to someone out there. You start out with all the data you can get your hands on. You use visualization, other data analysis approaches to come up with some insight, something that you've learned about your data. And then when you communicate it, you strip it down to only the data that is necessary to get that message across. So that is maybe the big take-home message of my presentation today. And hopefully the different kinds of approaches to figure out how to visualize data will help you next time you try to come up with a good data visualization, whether it's for exploration or for communication or for confirmation. Thank you very much.
Nils, thank you. That was a really outstanding overview of many of the things that people should be watching for as they're trying to communicate the message of their large-scale data, and especially as we collect more and more of it, we need effective ways to concisely present that information to an audience that they may not fully understand the scale and scope of that big data, but we want to get those messages across. And I was curious because at the sort of end of your presentation, you had talked about the data to ink ratio, and I know that Dr. Tufte has been one of the biggest advocates for that. Can you make some further comments about the importance of that and helping to streamline one's graphics to make sure that they don't violate that? And what are some kind of rules of thumb that one might use?
Right. So, for example, I can give a one example is when you create a bar chart. Right. So think about, does it matter? Like if each bar is a separate category, you already by separating the bars, do you need to put color on top of each of these bars? This is pretty much the example that I showed you just now, where no, we probably don't need to put color on each of these bars because that's all. We want to distinguish them from each other, and that's taking place simply by having 4 separate bars. Now, a different story here could be if we do have a second variable that we care about. So here's April, May, June, July. Maybe we care about the fact that in April, let's mark the months where we had a snowstorm, which I think is probably not going to happen in Boston this year. But then we would have like months with a snowstorm. Then we would use 2 colors to maybe indicate snowstorm or no snowstorm on top of these bars. So we really don't include any unnecessary things. Or if someone asks you what does that mean and you don't have an answer, then remove it. So, and you should really ask yourself that question about almost everything you put, or everything you put in your visualization. Why is it there? It has to have a reason to be there. Otherwise, it's an unnecessary embellishment, like 3D effects. In fact, 3D effects can be pretty harmful because you get darker colors, for example, at the bottom of the bar, and they get lighter towards the top. So we will always, like, if we really care about the values and length of these bars, but having darker colors at the bottom, it might draw more attention to the bottom of the chart rather than to the top, where actually the differences are that we might want to highlight. And so there is a really wide range of sort of mistakes that we tend to make, often because tools suggest that we make that mistake, right? So if you make a standard bar chart in any of the many, say, spreadsheet programs out there, it'll generally not take, this mantra to maximize the data to ink ratio into account. It'll give you nice colors for whatever reason. Right? There is probably a good reason for that in other worlds, but as scientists and maybe science communicators, we really want to be accurate. And I think for us, the need to make our visualizations exciting so that people look at them is often not given. There is often not a reason for that, because people will look at the data because they do care about it. It's not something that we need to convince them to look at the bar chart in our paper. Right? So they have a natural inclination to look at it because they want to know what you did. It's different if you're trying to go out into the world and draw attention to a problem in the world. Then there's more of a reason to think about how do we get attention. But I would argue that getting attention is always second to getting data across as accurately as possible.
And I think that's a great point. Yeah, that's a great point for us to end on, and because we're at the top of the hour, I want to thank everybody in our audience for joining us today. And Nils, I want to thank you for giving us a very useful guide of how to represent our data graphically and in our papers for maximum effect. And I want to encourage everybody to tune in next week when we have, actually next week we will not be having one. Our speaker had a health concern and so has had to cancel on us. We'll try and find another time to schedule something with that speaker in the future, but for next week we will not be having one of our data science seminar series. My deep apologies for that, but at any rate, I hope that we will see you again in the future. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Nils.
Thank you very much. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Bye, everyone.